Hi, Jenny, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi.
It's Casey.
Oh, Casey. Okay. Thanks for helping out today. Can you make me a host?
Yes, and I'm going to rename you as well.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to rename you. You're still listed as Jennifer Boston right now, so I'm going to change your
Oh,
name to.
that's me. I thought that was okay. Thank you.
Okay, you are the host. If you want to make me the co-host, just in case anything goes wrong, and then you should be all set.
And you're under Colorado PUC Hearing Room B, right?
Right.
All right. Make co-host. There you go.
Perfect. You're all set. Otherwise, the stream is going and the recording started, so you should be all set on my end.
Great. Thanks very much, Casey.
No problem.
Bye. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll wait another minute or so, allow a few other folks to sign in. I think we had somewhere north of 40 people that registered for this session, and so I'm seeing only about maybe 10 or so far. So let's just give it another minute or so. For those who just joined us, I'm gonna hold off just maybe another minute, and make sure we have a critical mass before we launch into today's session. All right, well, folks, I think we have a healthy quorum now, and I think we can get going with today's session on optimizing the existing transmission system. I am Dan Greenberg. I'm an advisor here with the Colorado PUC, and I would like to welcome you all to today's workshop, and thank everyone really for participating in today's session. I'm looking forward to your active participation. And also for those of you who have submitted comments previously in this docket, I'm not sure. I think the docket number does show up later, but for anyone who doesn't know it, it's 23M-0472E. And we will be certainly accepting and really inviting additional comments based on this workshop and the other three that are part of this series. Today, we're asking participants to respond to a few specific questions to try to resolve conflicts that appear in comments, or to respond to issues that are not addressed in the original set of questions we sent out about a year ago. And so without further ado, I think I will share my presentation for today. And hopefully that is working. It looks like it is. And away we go. We're going to be talking about optimizing the existing transmission system. A few notes before we launch into the substantive stuff. I'm leading this workshop, not the commissioners, but your input today will be very important and help me advise and others on advisory staff advise the commissioners as they prepare for the formal rulemaking process that we're expecting to start either later this year or early next. Just so you know, we can't give legal advice, and often we're not allowed to share opinions with the public, particularly about pending adjudications. And speaking of pending adjudications, let's try to avoid discussing topics that are coming up in other ongoing proceedings at the commission. If you've been to the other two workshops we've done so far in this series, you'll know that this slide is really just to show that we're in pre-rulemaking here. This is the very beginning of the process, very early. There will be lots of opportunities for further input by parties as we move through the formal rulemaking process. And thought it might be interesting for folks to know who all is on this call. Folks that have registered include people from the Public Utilities Commission, like myself, the Colorado Transmission Authority, the Energy Office, the Consumer Advocate, We have all our jurisdictional utilities represented today, as well as Core Electric and Colorado Springs utilities. We have a variety of stakeholders: environmental, business, consumer advocates, technology vendors, technology associations, independent power producers, interested ratepayers, and some independent grid policy and technology consultants. A few words about logistics. This has worked quite well in the previous workshops. So when you would like to make a comment, please raise your hand, and I will look for those and call on you. If you've joined by phone, you can dial *9, and I will call on you. It'd be helpful if you could modify your Zoom name to include your affiliation so people can see that when you're speaking. To do that, you click on those 3 dots when you hover over your image, and you'll see an option there to rename, or I think it's called rename, and you'll be able to add your affiliation there. And also when you speak, please do start with your name and affiliation. Few requests about today: be concise, a lot to cover today, and we have limited time. So we want to get in as many viewpoints as we can. So please try to be concise. Try not to repeat yourself or others at great length. If possible, I won't hold anyone to this, but if it's possible, it's preferable for organizations that have multiple people participating today. Select one person to respond to any given issue. Obviously, please be collaborative and treat others with respect. At the bottom there, another bid or another request to submit any comments that you care to share with us. And I've put a deadline, I've asked for a deadline of Friday, December 13th for comments on this workshop or any of the others. So without further ado, here's this workshop. We're going to consider whether, and if so how, the potential for beneficial application of advanced transmission technologies in Colorado should be assessed and capitalized upon. I'm going to start by working through a couple of definitions, then move into the assessment of what the potential for advanced transmission technologies might be on the Colorado grid. Then after that, look at moving from that potential assessment to actually implementing projects. Then spend some time talking about prioritizing optimization versus other needs. We may take a break, depends on the time. Hopefully we'll have a break there. Then optimization versus gold plating. How do we know when a proposal for optimizing the grid is really an optimization proposal and doesn't go too far, doesn't stray too far into gold plating territory? And then finally, I had some questions about are there situations where ATT might be useful as a temporary solution versus a long-term solution? So that's a quick look at the agenda. I just want to note that thus far I've been notoriously bad in estimating times that you see here. So if today's workshop is like the previous workshops, we'll probably be done well before 5 o'clock, but that all depends on how talkative all of you are. Okay, so first I wanted to, well, the first subject up for today is a couple of definitions. The first being grid optimization. And my question here is, should the commission adopt a specific definition for grid optimization and or grid optimization projects, or should these terms be interpreted on a case-by-case basis? And what you see here is some, I tend to prefer the idea of defining these terms, but very interested in what you all may have to say about this. And you can see my proposed definitions here on the slide. So this, with that, I will ask folks to raise your hand if you have any comments on this subject, on these on whether we should adopt definitions, and if so, any comments on the definitions that I'm proposing here. And I see that Mr. Milosevic, you have raised your hand, so please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Larry Milosevic. I'm an, I guess, independent ATT advocate. Um, yes, I think grid optimization should be defined in a general way just to avoid misinterpretation and runaway expansion definitions and potential loopholes. Um, in order to clarify that grid optimization does not include traditional transmission projects like removing substation constraints or uprating traditional conductors, I would suggest that the word process maybe be replaced with wording something along these lines. Grid optimization refers to the use of advanced transmission technologies and modern techniques to increase the capacity, utilization, or operational efficiency of one or more existing transmission assets. And I'd also suggest at least considering the idea of removing in a cost-effective manner, partly because not all benefits are monetary, such as reliability and resilience benefits, but mainly because cost effectiveness seems more relevant to the question of whether or not to implement a given grid optimization project than as part of the primary definition of grid optimization.
If I could, I just want to clarify that last part. Could you say that again? So you said you would take cost effective out of this definition. I think I missed the last part of what you said.
I guess the main reason is because cost effectiveness of a project seems more relevant to the question of whether or not to implement a proposed project rather than as part of a primary definition of grid optimization. That's just a question that came to my mind when I read that.
I see. So, okay. So I understand. So you're not suggesting that it need not be cost effective, but you are saying that there are non-quantifiable benefits and that that cost effectiveness need not be the definition of included in the definition of grid optimization.
Yeah, that's actually kind of in line with the current Rule 3627, which it does not use the term least cost. It uses the term best cost or best value, indicating that perhaps non-monetary benefits and costs, I suppose, as well, could or perhaps should be considered.
Okay, thanks very much. Mm-hmm. Any other comments on this one? Yeah, Mr. Wilson.
So two things. I would say transmission optimization, not grid optimization, because when I hear the word grid, I think of the whole grid, but we want to include individual transmission lines. Also, we're not talking about distribution optimization. So I just would prefer transmission optimization. Second comment, replying to Larry, I would not limit this to just advanced transmission technologies used on transmission lines. We need a lot of upgrades to the substations, and I don't think we should exclude that. There are lots of constraints. We're seeing that in the San Luis Valley issues all over the place. So I wouldn't limit it to just advanced transmission technologies, and certainly not to advanced transmission technologies just on transmission lines. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Milosevic, I'll invite you to respond if you like, but before that, why don't we go to Mr. Brame?
Yes, I'm speaking to Mr. Moses' comment. It just may be not the place for it, or maybe it is. I also agree very much that there are other benefits of grid optimization. I'm just wondering where, for example, we might include wildfire mitigation, wildfire resilience. Is that, for the purpose of this, is that a grid optimization, or is that another benefit we'll talk about later?
Question. I do think, ideally, ideally we will be doing planning that integrates all needs, not simply optimization projects solely for optimization, but integrating optimization in the process of implementing projects for other needs, such as wildfire mitigation.
So just to be clear, you're arguing that the grid optimization is a fairly broad description.
It is,
Okay, thank you.
and the way I'm conceptualizing it is that particularly is that we're looking to identify the opportunities for grid optimization in the existing grid, but also as new projects are being built, opportunities to, for instance, integrate dynamic line rating and power flow control where appropriate would be considered, regardless of the need for which the need that's driving the new projects. Does that make sense? Am I being clear on that?
Yes, and here just specific example. For example, one of the things you can do to optimize the grid is to reconductor, and you can reconductor with advanced conductors, or sometimes called advanced reconductoring. One of the side benefits of reconducting with advanced conductors, when done properly, is you reduce sag and you increase resilience. So that's just a side benefit of optimizing for capacity, of the existing grid for capacity.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll move on to Mr. Lair.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'm Ron Lair. I'm an attorney in Inglewood, and I'm serving on the board of the CETA, but I'm not speaking for them. I had a question here whether operation of the transmission system is intended to be included here. And I'm thinking of the experience that's being gained by Arizona Public Service Company who've moved the operation of their transmission system from deterministic line ratings to a flow-based transmission operation. So is that included in scope here, or are operations outside of scope?
I would say that I would include them. So in my proposed definition here, increasing capacity utilization or operational efficiency. So I would definitely include, because there are, I think we have heard and will hear today again that technology like dynamic line ratings is really is a operational technology rather than one that increases the capacity that can be relied on in all situations. That's, I think, the argument that the utilities are making. But in any case, in response to your question, I think operation is important as well.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Just one other comment. It seems to me that the flow-based operation of the transmission system is a characteristic of a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator. But we may not get there. I mean, it's still an open question whether Colorado utilities will be in such a place or not, and it may be that we'll come up short of that. And if so, then operations on a flow-based basis, it would be in prospect. So just that footnote. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Lair, before you sign off, I wonder if you could provide two things. First, I want to provoke, there are folks on the participating today, they may not know what the acronym CETA is. So I just want to clarify that that's the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority, and Mr. Lair sits on its board. But I wonder if you could provide a quick explanation of flow-based operations.
Yeah, I'm no expert in it, but we have had among clean energy advocates 2 briefings by Arizona Public Service Company's team that implemented it. And what I gathered from that is that instead of taking the transmission capacity of various lines and aspects of the transmission system in a deterministic or setting it up based on the WEC line capacities, they have instrumented their transmission system in a way that gives them real-time or closer to real-time information about the capability of the system. So using that information, they're able to dispatch the transmission system more effectively than having it under the line limits that are established like once a year or something.
Line limits, yeah. So that sounds a lot like dynamic line rating to me. Do you know if there's a difference?
I think my sense from the APS presentations that we heard is that it's similar, but I think there are more characteristics in addition to dynamic line rating in the Arizona approach.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much,
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Laird. And Mr. Lunar from Public Service, please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. Jared Lunar from Public Service Company of Colorado. Wanted to key in on something that Mr. Lair brought up there as well, and that's kind of distinguishing between some of the planning aspects of grid optimization compared to some of the operational aspects. And we think it's probably pretty important to distinguish between the two, and to also recognize that the planning-based optimization, things such as deploying, advanced conductors on existing lines, uprating existing substations, is already really factored into the existing planning process. The 10-year plan as it exists today, our concept that we've laid out for a 20-year plan in this proceeding, we think is meant to account for going out and determining what sort of ATTs or other grid configurations can be implemented on that long-term basis to provide enhanced capacity. So we might be kind of splitting up and kind of scattering our consideration of how these things work by trying to have a grid optimization process and project live uniquely separate from the existing planning processes that are evaluating the long-term needs of the grid. A way that this could potentially help add value is if it were to focus more on those operational aspects of the system rather than kind of replacing or supplementing the existing long-term planning process. So that would be, and this probably goes as much to the next agenda item as this one, but we think that distinguishing between long-range expansion planning and technologies that really impact the day-to-day real-time operation of the system, and having separate forums in which each of those things are considered would be the best way to help address this. So that way, ATTs that don't create long-term capacity but might still have some benefits for the grid can be established and evaluated on their terms, and those aren't pulled into the long-range capacity planning process, where because they don't create long-range capacity, they're not really viewed as solutions that could be picked in a transmission plan for that reason.
Thanks, Mr. Lunar. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to take a look at the deck that I sent out to all registrants, but one of the things we'll be talking about in a little while is the assessment of the potential on the existing grid. So, given that the existing grid has a heck of a lot more capacity than anything in any of the transmission plans we've seen so far, that's going to be, I think, the primary focus of a technical potential study, and perhaps the more important application of any definitions that we land on.
Yeah, and I'll say that to bring it back to kind of the long range planning aspect of it, something like an advanced conductor is only going to have value to the grid to be deployed where there is an identified need that comes up through the planning process. So we think, as we view the planning process as it already exists today, that sort of optimization is one of the alternatives that the utility will evaluate in the planning process to determine whether that sort of capacity-based optimization is a viable alternative for us to propose.
Well, let me push back on you a little bit on that one, Mr. Lunar. And I do want to leave room for other folks to chime in on this, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is there's no room on the existing grid. There's no overriding need to do anything about the existing grid except where it can help address emerging needs. And I think what I'm suggesting with my proposal for technical potential study and an implementation plan is that there's opportunity on the existing grid to save ratepayers money by making the grid more efficient, and in some cases it may well contribute to alleviating need for addressing load growth or the like, or other needs.
The distinction I'm trying to make is that different technologies serve different purposes. Some of them create long-term capacity. Some of them create operational benefits to kind of the day-to-day operation of the grid. Given that the long-term capacity piece is already covered within the planning process, we would view it as beneficial to have this grid optimization to really focus on the more real-time operational aspects of ATTs rather than having a separate forum where we're looking for opportunities to go, reconduct or align when that line hasn't been identified as an overloaded facility in a 10-year transmission plan.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
And Mr. Wilson, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say a word about flow-based versus what we have is contract-based transmission. And Ron is right. Flow-based has the capacity to provide a lot more capabilities in the system. It's a big step to go from where we are to that. And the reason is that virtually all of the transmission in Colorado is under contract. So companies contract for capacity on transmission lines. And when you go to flow-based, it's all thrown into a pool. And then, usually it's in an RTO, they can operate it more efficiently because it's all in a pool. If you have two wind farms, one which has good wind and has, say, 20 megawatts of capacity, and another that's not operating at full capacity, you can't really share that. So you have to over time break those contracts and move to a flow-based, and usually that happens when you go into an RTO ISO. Arizona's APS is looking at doing it sooner, which is great, but it's a big change. Anyway, thanks. Hope that
I
helps.
appreciate that. Thanks very much. Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
Hi, Dan. Julia Selker with the Watt Coalition. Just wanted to quickly respond to Jared Luner's point. I do think having the grid optimization definition cover both planning and operations makes sense. His point that some of this might be found in the existing planning process is good, but I think there's still a lot left on the table. So having a separate definition for some projects could be useful. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Asher.
Yeah, thanks. Eli Asher with Line Vision. 2 points I'd like to make. I'd like to support the points that Ms. Selker just made. In addition, I'd like to kind of push back on this concept that we're hearing that GETs or ATTs are not necessarily can be used within the planning context. Operational experience will certainly help utilities better understand how these tools can be used within the planning context. But just to provide a bit of an example, I think that the common pushback that we hear in this regard is that a lot of ATTs do not necessarily provide firm fixed capacity. That once upon a time was the exact same pushback that we saw with certain resources like solar and wind, which we know are not 100% firm fixed. However, the vast majority of utilities have moved towards an integrated resource planning process that determines what their portfolio of solar and wind does look like. And therefore, there are ways to utilize these tools within the planning process. So wanted to kind of reiterate that point. And second, kind of going back to the original question and the definition proposed here, I think that if the phrase cost effective does continue to stay within this definition, then the definition could benefit from an expansion of what cost effective means, namely delineating some of those benefits and costs. So for example, on the benefits side, delineating that congestion relief, deferred or avoided transmission costs, reliability improvements are all, reliability improvements through more accurate line ratings are all quantifiable aspects that can be factored into a cost effectiveness analysis. And on the cost side, the cost to, install, maintain, and operate these assets as well. So to the extent cost effective does maintain within the definition, it could benefit from a delineation of what those benefits and costs are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brame, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I also would like to echo Mr. Asher and Ms. Selker's comments. And going back again on the point that was made by Mr. Lunar, true, and probably most advanced conductors are utilized or the major uses for increasing capacity. But I would just note that our largest customer in the U.S., their primary reason for using it is sag mitigation, environmental reasons, and the capacity increase is just a side benefit. At least right now, it's a side benefit. So I agree very much with the other commentators that taking the most broad view is best, and not trying to silo technologies or capabilities. Because they are not part of the existing planning. They may be partially part of the existing planning effort. They may not, all the benefits may not be considered in the existing planning efforts. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, CTC Global, I forgot to say that earlier.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Suchida, welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Bruce Suchida from the Battle Group. I think so far the benefits that's been discussed were the immediate benefits, whether it's congestion avoidance or reliability or whatnot. But if you think about these ATTs, they actually have a third dimension called time. For example, the typical transmission project takes 5 to 10 years, and you can actually use these to buy that time. Buying time just is not necessarily limited to, let's say, avoiding congestion during that 5-year time period through DLR, but depending on how the market develops, the congestion patterns can differ quite significantly in 5 years. If you take a look at what happened in ERCOT, once they went from the zonal to the nodal, the congestion pattern was totally different from what they were expecting. And so a lot of the projects that were developed during the zonal times were no longer, they built it, but were no longer as cost effective as what happened after it went to a nodal market. And so one of the benefits is that these ATTs can buy time. So if you install ATTs right now, that will kind of delay your actual investment needs until that real time comes closer. And then at that time, because you installed ATTs, you can make another decision saying, okay, it's year plus 5 now. Do I really want to build this new line, or should I pull it back? And that kind of benefit, the time associated benefit, is something that should be recognized, but it also goes into both the operational and the planning, because that time value actually goes into planning. So I'm somewhat concerned about splitting into operations and planning without necessarily recognizing the time effect of these. Thank you.
And while we have Mr. Suchida, any comments on? I believe you've been involved in a number of projects, or at least perhaps designing, specifying, or identifying the opportunities for certain projects. What do you know about the time frame over which, and I'm sure it varies from one technology to another, but well, I guess a switch to a carbon core conductor would be a reconductoring project, so that the utilities have lots of experience with that. What would be an approximate time frame for the implementation of a power flow control solution?
So power flow control can be done in 2 ways. One is the physical asset, like a phase angle regulator, phase shifter, or smart wires. I think I saw someone from Smart Wires here, but through that physical control. The other option could be using topology optimization by opening and closing lines. And if it's topology optimization, it's a software, so it's a lot faster than actually physically implementing a flow, although the coarseness of that control is perhaps better with the physical asset, because when you open or close lines, you're relying on Kirchhoff's law to figure out whether you can't really say, I just want 50% of this flow to go in that direction. So I think it depends on what your needs are, but software solutions are a lot faster than hardware solutions.
And even the hardware solutions, would you say it's accurate to say that in many cases the hardware power flow solution would be substantially faster than going through the regulatory process and completing design acquisition and actually getting the permits and building the line, certainly substantially faster than that.
Yes, I think so. And I think the application depends on what you're trying to do. So if the line that you're trying to enhance or rebuild or reconduct or whatever, it's not overloaded that much. Some of these ATTs can help alleviate that immediately. But if the line that you're trying to enhance or reconduct or rebuild is really congested and the capacity that you need is potentially beyond 50% of what it is today, or basically 1.5x or 2x, then there's probably better solutions than ATTs, like advanced conductors may be the more appropriate way of doing that. And so in many cases, they're faster, but it really depends on the application that you're trying to figure.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any more hands going. Oh, yes, I do. I see Mr. Hefner from Tri-State. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'll mention that I also have Jonathan Fidrich on the call as well from Tri-State. And, I think from the perspective of being a transmission provider, one thing we see that's maybe missing here is a reliability component, and just making sure that that stays top of mind as these concepts are considered. And, I think a little bit consistent with the comment you just heard, as well as some of what Mr. Lunar said, there does seem to be a distinction between optimization solutions that are looking at a 10% type increase or a 10% type improvement versus a planning solution that would be a major 1.5x 2x plus type difference in the overall outcome, and finding a way to recognize that some of this is more in the realm of planning, whereas some of it is more in the realm of real time or optimization or whatever you might want to call it. I don't know that we have specific revisions here, other than to say this is sort of a tricky concept to nail down, and it's hard to have a rule that's broad enough to capture, I think, what you're looking to capture, but not so broad as to become sort of everything to everyone and meaningless.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate your comments there. All right, well, why don't we move along to, I'm a little confused, but all right, so you've been seeing it. So I wanted to move along now to the definition of advanced transmission technology. So the question here is, should the commission adopt an explicit list of advanced technologies or a more general definition of what constitutes an ATT, or both? So first I'll just show, this is a proposed list of what the ATT candidates would be if we were to go with a list. And you'll see at the bottom there's kind of a bucket for new technologies that come along that would fit a definition of ATT. So that is one way to go. And I think I'll just pause here and see if there are any comments on this list.
Hi. Can I jump in? Julia
Yes,
Selker
please
with the
go
Watt
ahead,
Coalition.
Ms. Selk.
Great. So I think that list generally looks good. And in my experience reviewing legislation and policy from other states, having both a list and a general definition, with space for technologies to come makes a lot of sense. Make sure that the beneficial technologies available today are used and the ones to come have room. So that would be my take.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Milosevic.
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest a couple of wording changes for the last two items. I'd suggest being more clear that controllable load refers to the distribution level, and that the essence of the idea is to reduce demand on the transmission system as being equivalent to increasing transmission system capacity. And maybe I'd propose some wording like the following: controllable load, a distribution level measures that reduce or shape demands on the transmission system, including but not limited to demand response, virtual power plants, energy storage, community solar, and microgrids, something along those lines. And then on the final item, I'd suggest considering replacing the word newly, because it might imply only things that, while new, are already in existence, when I believe the intent is to include relevant technologies that may be developed in the future. And so maybe wording along the lines of unspecified future commercialized technologies with grid optimization capabilities or something like that. And also, though I'm not sure about this, but would ask whether superconductors have reached a practical and commercialized status yet. I guess I really don't know about that, or whether they're currently in the sort of unspecified future technologies category. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thanks very much. And I would echo that. I don't know that I do know superconductors have been applied in utilities. Some utilities have found applications for them, but perhaps I imagine we have others on the line today who can answer that question as to whether we should consider that one commercialized, or whether it would fall into the last item on this list. Mr. Wilson.
So a couple of suggestions. First, you should not say advanced carbon core conductors. You should just say advanced conductors, because there are other types of advanced conductors, and who knows what will be available soon or in the distant future even. Secondly, you're missing one important type of ATT, and that is high surge impedance loading, HSIL. That's a technology that's very good for longer transmission lines like we have in the state. It's a different kind of architecture for usually new lines, but it's a very important one.
So it's a design, really. It's a design choice utilizing, if I'm not mistaken, it could be utilizing conventional conductors. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, and it's listed in the DOE advanced conductor, ATT comments or paper. The third is, controllable load. That's really demand side or distribution grid side, and it's really dealt with in the distribution system plans, DSPs. I don't know that it belongs here. One other suggestion: lists are a little dangerous. If you're going to put one in, you should put language like list includes but is not limited to ABCD, etc. Otherwise, you get in arguments eventually between people saying something new is or isn't a member of the set. Anyway, thanks.
No, appreciate that. Thanks very much. I believe the name is pronounced Rozek. Mr. Rozek, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, hi, Parker Rozak, Xcel Energy, Public Service. I had maybe two comments. So I would agree we should remove the word carbon core, because the core doesn't matter. It's about the conductor. The conducting material is the advancement. You can use any different core you want. sag and other things are all part of design, not really part of the flow of electricity across the grid. And then superconductors, I would probably agree it's probably not commercially ready. Veer is starting to pilot with INL, hopefully next year, assuming they can get a transformer and some other things they're asking for. But I don't think it's a problem leaving it on the list. I also agree with the comment that you know, opening it up to including other technologies as they develop instead of being firm. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brame.
Having previously been with American Superconductor, there is one commercial superconducting project currently active. It's more of a, well, no, it's a distribution voltage, but it is in fact a transmission project in Chicago. So it does exist at least in one case, and I know they're looking at others. Going to the comments by the most recent, by Parker's and the gentleman from Costa's comments earlier, one of the challenges is there has been this attempt to broaden the definition of advanced conductor so they include a lot of the traditional steel core conductors. And we would be, of course, very opposed to that because the position is there's really not any steel core conductors as an advanced conductor because of thermal expansion and other similar arguments have similar points. We certainly don't think you necessarily have to specify it based on the carbon core, but the carbon core is an integral part of the conductor. And one of the reasons we don't think any steel conductors should be considered advanced conductors is you have that steel core, which is a big resistor running in the middle of the core. So we've seen that definitions before, like advanced carbon and or composite core conductors, or specifically the DOE's liftoff report defines advanced conductors as conductors that has at least 50% more capacity for a like-to-like basis, at least 20% of better efficiency, and significantly less thermal sag. So that's another way to potentially define advanced conductors without defining as a specific technology. Thank you.
Mr. Brame, wonder if I could ask you to either file that DOE report that you just mentioned in our e-filing system, or send it directly to me and I will file it myself.
I will do so, and I will ask Ms. Selker to remind me to do so because I know she follows that report as well.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Milosevic.
I just wanted to follow up on two comments that were made before. One is I'd kind of like to defend the idea of that controllable load does belong in this list. And while it's true that it's a distribution level thing, it belongs in distribution system planning and would be very helpful in many ways in distribution system planning. But it also, I think, belongs on this list because the idea here is that it's specifically looking for distribution level measures to reduce demands on the transmission system for transmission planning purposes, like as an alternative to, for example, some other ATT or building a new line to reduce load on the transmission system by looking at the distribution level. And so for that reason, I think it belongs on a list of transmission alternatives, as well as, of course, being relevant to distribution system planning. And the other is I'd just like to put a +1 on the idea that some specificity or something is needed with advanced conductors, because I have noticed utilities very often will imply that they have evaluated advanced conductors and they'll use terms like HTLS, high temperature, low sag. We looked at high temperature, low sag conductors, which then it turns out they're talking about ACSS, which is like old technology and does not have some of the advantages that carbon core conductor does have. The fact that the carbon core is there does matter. It gives the conductor entirely new characteristics and new opportunities for ratepayer savings and like reusing towers and things like that. So those are my follow-up comments.
Thanks very much. Yes, Mr. Lair.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing that the controllable load is an aspect of the distribution system, and I'm reminded that we do, I think, have large customers who are connected to the system at transmission voltages, and I wouldn't want to leave them out as as an opportunity to control their loads. So I just wanted to make that point. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see. I think given that we are where we are, I will move along. The next item on this same slide actually is the alternative, or it's not really necessarily an alternative. We might, in addition to having a specific list, we might also want to define the term, what does ATT mean? And I propose the following. In advanced transmission technologies, any technology or operational practice applied to a new or existing transmission asset that is intended to increase that asset's capacity, utilization, or operational efficiency. Any comments on that idea? Mr. Milosevic, you are quick on the draw. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I went through all these, so I have my notes right at hand for all of these slides. Yeah, anyway, that's a pretty good definition, I think, but I would suggest adding a phrase to the end, and is distinct from traditional transmission technologies that were in widespread use in the 20th century, or something along those lines, just to sort of reduce the ability to find loopholes in the definition.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Mr. Stoll from Grid United.
Hey everyone, Aaron Stoll, Grid United. So my comment is more on the last slide, but apologies, got sidetracked and didn't get my hand up in time. But I would like to propose adding high voltage direct current, HVDC, to the advanced transmission technology candidates.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll say here again that the way I was thinking this through was really looking at the existing, today's session is really about looking at optimizing the existing system. And certainly that may involve HVDC in some situations. Strikes me that would certainly be a new line, but I'll take your comment and see. I mean, please go ahead if you have more to say on that. But I would also ask for other folks' opinion about whether HVDC should be included on this list.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is, totally hear you on the existing grid, but there are existing HVDC back-to-back ties in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one in particular. But as we think about, like, especially in the planning realm, I think that could be of use, but totally hear you. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, not seeing anybody who wants to take up that issue, but it's a good point. We do have an existing HVDC line going into Oklahoma, I believe. No, or is it Texas? I think it's Oklahoma. Little used, and could in the future, might be interesting to look at expanding the capacity of that line. Okay, why don't we move along then? Let's see. Here we go. The next subject is the assessment of the potential of ATTs within the state. I have a few questions I'd like to pose. And first, I'm not aware of any existing studies of the value of ATTs that ATTs could provide within the state or to any specific utility system within the state. And I'm very curious to see if anyone has any information on any existing studies that could be termed a technical or economic potential study. Yeah, Mr. Wilson, please go ahead.
Yes. During the Power Pathway CPCN, there was Excel, at the request of the commission, did a study of the advantages and disadvantages of using advanced conductors. So that's available.
Sorry, Mr. Wilson, if I could clarify.
Yes.
Was that a general study, or are you referring to the analysis they did of the savings specific to the Power Pathway?
The latter, yes.
That's what I thought. Okay,
Yes. I'm trying to remember. We have talked a lot about advanced transmission technologies and the Colorado Coordinated Planning Group, CCPG. I don't know that we did, that there's a study there. Some of the other people in that might help me out on that, but there has been a lot of discussion on the topic in that group. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Milosevic.
Yeah, I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for there. I'm not aware of any studies specific to Colorado, but there are relevant studies to Colorado. And the one that comes to mind, obviously, there's someone else on the call, Mr. Cicita, that's better equipped to speak about this than me, but that's the Brattle Group study of GETS on the SPP transmission system in Kansas and Oklahoma. It was the modeling in the study focused on production cost savings and found that targeted implementation of the 3 GETS grid enhancing technologies could double the amount of renewable energy interconnected on the system and thereby reduce the interconnection queues at a cost that's paid for by the benefits in only 6 months. The benefits in Colorado may or may not be as large as that's seen in the SPP study, but that study clearly shows that an assessment of ATT on the Colorado system is warranted. And also, there are numerous relevant studies on reconductoring with advanced carbon core conductor, including the Grid Strategies report and the Berkeley study, both of which I previously already filed into the docket of this proceeding. And just wanted to mention those potentially relevant, though not Colorado-specific studies.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I just wanted to basically, my impression is that we don't really have anything, any analyses specific to Colorado, and I believe that's been confirmed. Thank you for your comments. Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
Just Julie Selker with the Watt Coalition again, confirming that I don't know of any Colorado-specific studies that included grid enhancing technologies, and it is important to study these on the actual grid. There isn't a great rule of thumb for where advanced power flow control can solve a problem, for instance. You just have to look at the conditions on the grid and do the evaluation. So it would be very valuable to have a technical and economic potential assessment.
Thank you. All right, my second question, is there any information on what it might cost to conduct such a study? Would it be prohibitively expensive for public service or Black Hills ratepayers? Anyone have information on what such studies may have cost in other jurisdictions? Mr. Asher, I think you may be responding to the first question, but either one, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'll hit on both. Again, Eli Asher with Line Vision. Yeah, going back to the first question, I would just generally encourage following along with the developments of West Tech. I know it's a broader study across the entire West, but could certainly have implications for Colorado. And I know that it is exploring the value of advanced transmission technologies and transmission expansion. One other study that I will mention is a study that we, being Line Vision, participated in through the DOE's, it's called the TRAC program, TRAC. In 2021, we conducted a deployment along with Oak Ridge National Labs that included an assessment of ATTs in Colorado. Now, it was not kind of like a system-wide assessment, which I think is, would be the primary goal here and what you're ultimately getting at, but nonetheless, a study assessing advanced transmission technologies in the state. So it's certainly worth a review. I would be happy, Mr. Greenberg, to provide you with the link if that would be helpful to you.
Yes, certainly would. And just to reiterate or to verify, you said that's specific to Colorado.
Yes, that study was conducted in Colorado, and I'm on with my colleague Christine Engel, and if she has anything to add on that, I'll let her do so. And then before that, I'll just also respond to your second question. I will let others who might be more familiar with specific costs jump in and identify what those costs might look like. However, based on my experience, having worked for a utility and also in the consulting world, I would assume that the study cost would likely be in the low 100,000s, possibly even below. And that is likely to pale in the, when compared to the benefits, which would be in the multitude of millions that would be achieved within a couple of years of deploying ATTs, as was just highlighted by Mr. Milosevic and conducted by Mr. Tsuchida at Brattle. That SPP study looked at a $90 million GETS deployment that in just 1 year returned 175 million in production cost savings alone. So that does not include additional benefits. That's only 1 year, which demonstrated a payback period of 6 months. So ultimately, I can't speak to specific study examples and what they cost. However, it seems like the costs are likely to be relatively low in comparison to what the benefits achieved would look like.
And
Thanks.
Mr. Escher and perhaps Mr. Tsuchida, if we still have you, has there been any follow-on since that study conducted for SPP? I believe it was called Unlocking the Grid was the name of that study. Has there been any other follow-on that actually evaluates actual benefits of implementation that's been conducted following that study?
Not specifically. I think it was called Unlocking the Queue. I haven't done anything beyond that for SPP, but I have been working with other stakeholders. Sometimes they're private studies, so I can't really, tell too much details about it. But other studies on grid enhancing technologies in other regions as well. Just that they're not public, so I can't really share a lot about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Thanks. Well, let's go to Mr. Fidrick from Tri-State.
Hello. So Jonathan Fidrick with Tri-State. I did want to point out that the question was asked, is there any specific studies within Colorado that really evaluate ATTs? And at this point, in the CCPG planning group, specifically with regards to the San Luis Valley, there is an ongoing study that has started really evaluating carbon core conductors. So that is one that is ongoing in the state.
I understand that, and I participated in those meetings. I understand that study has looked at carbon core as an alternative, but it's not. You really wouldn't call it a study of technical potential for Tri-State or for any other utility.
No, it's really an evaluation of what it provides.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, sorry. Two things. One, I think everyone needs to remember that we do not have a market in Colorado. Part of the state will be in SPP, but the majority of the customers are not in a market. And for instance, the Brattle study was done in SPP. It's a market. The conditions of generation and service of load are very, very different. We have, as I said, contracts for transmission. I think instead of looking at a study of ATTs, we should be doing, as the FERC NOPR for DLR just proposed, and that is to look at congested transmission lines. So FERC proposed, and I helped one of the commenters reply, that utilities, well, RTOs, ISOs, all utilities should look at their transmission lines, identify lines that are congested, and also identify lines that are congested that have good wind, good direction, and good wind speed, such that they could experience cooling of the lines and get a benefit from DLR. So they're not saying go out and study ATTs. They're saying look at problems. So I just don't want us to get, to look at solutions in search of a problem. I think we should be looking at reporting on the problems. How much congestion is there resulting in curtailment? I don't think there's very much right now. Maybe there will be in a few years, but I think we should look at this whole issue from the other way around. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's see, Ms. Selker.
Yeah, just a quick comment that, well, I agree with Mr. Asher's point that that the cost of a study would not exceed the value of a study. There are federal programs to subsidize those studies. We'll see what the DOE, Department of Energy, looks like next year, but technical assistance grants through the Office of Energy Efficiency and others, and the Grid Deployment Office and others have funding for studies like this to support the staff time and other costs.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's see here. Mr. Milosevic, was that your hand still up, or did you have another comment?
Yes, my hand's still up. About cost, of course, I have no idea what an ATT study would cost. It's very interesting hearing Mr. Asher use a quite low number, like 100K. My comment is that it would be instructive to know what the cost of the CETA study was, statewide transmission study, and then take that number and divide it by the number by the utility customer base, and then by another factor of 3 to spread it out over 3 years. And I just did a ballpark estimate that a study that costs $5 million would cost each ratepayer about $1 per year, which I'd consider to be trivial and eliminate any concern about ratepayers funding a grid optimization study.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I wonder if I think I want to go back to Mr. Wilson's thought that we shouldn't be looking for solutions in search of problems. I guess my perspective is that there may be a lot of latent benefit to ratepayers in making the existing system more efficient, and that it is therefore, or would be beneficial to identify identify opportunities to cost effectively and really, hopefully highly cost effective applications where, deploying one or more technologies could result in significant benefits for ratepayers. So I wonder if there are others online who agree with what Mr. Wilson said, or if maybe I've mischaracterized what you said, Mr. Wilson. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so we have an IRP or an ERP process that is very specific and approves the generation and transmission that we need to serve our load. So, and we're not in an RTO ISO. So why would we need more capacity than we need? We serve the generation gets the load. If that's not costing the ratepayers anything, then they won't save anything. We don't know how much curtailment is there that's costing the ratepayers money. We don't know. That's what I'm saying. We should first have a process where we understand what the curtailment and from transmission congestion is causing, and how much is that costing ratepayers, and then how much should you spend to fix it. Maybe it's a lot, maybe it's nothing. My understanding is that most curtailment in the state is due to low load, not to transmission problems. So I think that's where we should start.
So, Mr. Wilson, I just want to, you made the statement that our ERP process procures both generation and transmission. I would say it can certainly impose transmission costs, but there's no transmission investments that are procured through the ERP process. But secondly, I wanted to ask you to, I mean, I think the ERP process is not the be all and end all of what our needs are in the state, right? We have different processes for wildfire mitigation, for maintenance, replacement projects. And in the same vein, I would submit that there may be potentially very significant opportunities to improve the operation and therefore the operational costs of the existing system. And I think that's really what I'm trying to address here. And so, and I would take, and you mentioned curtailment, which is certainly a consideration for congested lines, but the congestion that's resulting in curtailment is another consideration. And I think what I'm asking about here is improvements to the existing system, which really are not considered or only tangentially considered in the ERP processes so far.
But my main point was we don't have a market where generators bid in on an hour by hour, day by day basis to provide the cheapest generation. We don't have that. And so it's a very, very different scenario. And so these huge numbers of cost savings aren't applicable in our market. That's my main point.
Not sure I'm understanding that. So I may ask you to fill that in a little bit. I think, help me understand, Mr. Wilson, how your statement is relevant to a situation where you have, and I think power flow control, there are very few places in this state where I think it's applicable because we don't have as much networked transmission. So let's choose a different technology. I'm sorry, that I didn't mean power flow control. I meant topology optimization. But let's look at reconductoring. If you could alleviate significant line losses on a heavily used line that would not otherwise be touched through the ERP process, what's the relevance of the difference between the vertically integrated utility that Colorado currently has and the ISO system?
I think if you really just look at line losses, that reconductoring does not ever prove out. I'll make that bold statement. I don't have the data in front of me, but I think that's fairly true. You reconductor when you need more capacity, you get a little more reduction in impedance, but not a whole lot. I mean, the corridor from Denver down to Pueblo, the line losses are almost zero. It's pretty much zero. I mean, I've heard commissioners say that. So I don't think that's a big issue. And we'll file comments and clarify that we think that we need to do an assessment of curtailment and congestion, but we think that's more important going forward than simply looking at ATTs in general, that we need to look at what is our problem. And in a market, they have a much better, they know exactly what's happening because they have multiple generation that is bidding on low prices. And so the congestion is a much more pertinent issue. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think I will go to Mr. Asher next. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just to kind of, I think, push back on Mr. Wilson's point, and I'm trying to look through, but I'm not intimately familiar with the numbers. I believe it might be under Excel Colorado's, I think it's maybe the Just Transition Plan, or perhaps it's the CEP. I'm forgetting at this very moment, but that that filing discusses a very significant amount of renewable resources that are expected to be built out, I think, between now and sometime around 2030. And that document does specifically get into how much of those clean resources are expected to be curtailed due to a lack of transmission capacity until the state is able to get that transmission built and up and running. And so I think that's just a perfect example of where we do have problems that are identified in the state of Colorado, whereby this renewable energy will be curtailed, and whether that is market related or related to the state's RPS goals, it would certainly be a negative impact to be curtailing this cleaner generation and deploying ATTs that can reduce some of the congestion on the system and therefore reduce the amount that would be curtailed would provide a very near-term benefit. And so just wanted to highlight that. I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but it was I do recall it's a very significant amount of curtailment expected until this transmission can get built, which, as we all know, will take quite some time.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Madrid, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Juan Roberto Madrid with Green Latinos. I was going to bring up a similar point that Eli Asher just mentioned there, and really looking at, with the anticipation of all these electrification programs, we're working on projects to electrify heavy-duty diesel trucks. We're working on projects to electrify charging for heavy-duty diesel, formerly diesel trucks in, like, say, the Commerce City area, in and around those areas. And those are going to put increased burden on the system. So then how are these systems then, how is that transmission going to be generated to be able to handle those increased loads, whether that's in Commerce City or whether that's in what we would term the inland port areas of Pueblo and some of these areas? Those are things that we're thinking about at Green Latinos and with our environmental partners.
Thank you for that, those comments. And I think just to very generically respond, I would say, that's going to be a focus of largely a focus of the distribution system plan that Public Service will be filing in the middle of, I believe it's due on December 16th. So you may want to pay attention to that one. Mr. Tsushita, please go ahead.
Thank you. So far, it looks like it feels like everyone's talking about the status quo or normal operations. But if you think about it, most of the times that congestion happens is when something goes out. So there may be a line going out, and then all of a sudden you're seeing congestion on the parallel line. And that line going out can be an accident, or it could also be maintenance outages. So I don't think just thinking about the system in normal operation conditions will do the benefit, because on the one hand, if you have dynamic line rating everywhere, maybe you won't use it. But one storm comes in, and that situational awareness of all the lines may just pay for it all, just one storm. Similarly, if you take a look at what topology optimization software does, it opens and closes lines or circuits to identify how to better flow, but you can use the same software to potentially identify the impact of an outage. And that could be part of the planning, saying, well, based on the topology optimization software, I should not take this certain line out on a maintenance outage in the month of May because it's going to cause this, but if it's in April, it's a lot better, and so on and so forth. So I think we probably want to step away from just thinking about the normal operation conditions and how to apply grid enhancing technologies or ATTs, but think about alternative approaches, because any of those events can likely pay for the investments that's needed.
The reliability benefits that might not be immediately apparent when thinking about implementing advanced technologies. Yes. Thanks very much. Mr. Milosevic, please go ahead.
I just kind of wanted to, where's the video? I just wanted to point out that what we're talking about now really is making the grid as a whole, we're thinking holistically, making it more efficient for the future, not solving individual problems as they arise, like regular transmission planning that is usually talked about. Grid optimization is it's a second separate thing from individual project planning to meet a single identified need of the moment. It's about taking this grid, which has been built up piecemeal, one project at a time for 100 years, and now it's just outrageously inefficient, and making it more efficient in order to reduce the future need for transmission projects at all. They just won't arise if we make better use of the transmission assets we already have. So I think it's kind of leads us astray if we try to think about grid optimization as a whole in terms of traditional transmission project, one project at a time planning, that they're really two separate things that will need to coexist. It's not like grid optimization replaces traditional transmission planning, but it certainly would be nice to make future transmission planning, more efficient. Fewer projects would likely be required in the future. So I just wanted to throw that distinction out there.
Appreciate that. Thanks very much. And Mr. Gilbert, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Jim Gilbert, and I'm an independent community advocate. And I was wondering if the broader term of ATTs here includes things like IVVOs and FLISRs, et cetera, because that is in the AGIS project that Excel has been conducting in Denver. And at least the last testimony I saw, that project was showing some savings, some cost efficiency savings, for instance, on IVVOs. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. And my knowledge of IVVO is somewhat limited, but my recollection is that is more of a distribution question. At least some of the solutions, some of the technologies used to deploy bulk bar optimization are on the kind of towards the edge of the grid. I wonder if anyone else on the line is able to either verify that or correct me.
Yeah, and I just want to say that also includes FLISR, et cetera. So it does. I mean, we're talking about a holistic solution, if you will, in that case, right?
Thank you. All right, I have another question here. Two more questions actually along these lines. Okay, so we already did that one, and so finally, should the Commission require utilities to conduct periodic assessments of the technical potential? If so, should it differentiate by utility type? How frequently should assessments be updated? Should the Commission specify in rule a list of ATTs? We've kind of discussed that one already. To be considered at minimum. I do like the suggestion to have a list, but leave it open to new technologies that may come along in the future. Any input on these questions? Well, Mr. Milosevic, you are getting a lot of airtime today, but right now you're the only hand up, so I'm going to go with you. Please go ahead.
Well, you asked. So on the question of which utilities, I would say for sure the IOUs, perhaps each contributing to the cost proportional to their customer base. But I think it's important that the tri-state system also be included in any ATT study if the Commission has that authority. I don't know if the Commission has that authority. And then on the frequency of assessments, periodic assessments would certainly be good, maybe every 3 to 5 years. But I think it's very important to get the first study right, and that it will be far more valuable than subsequent updates. So I would definitely recommend putting a focus on doing a really good first study, and leave it as a secondary consideration, the frequency of updates.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Selker, you may be going to address this, but as in your position as, I believe, an executive director of the WAC Coalition, you interact with a lot of vendors. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of any other jurisdictions where technical potential, I mean, we've talked about the Brattle study for SPP. I wonder if you're aware of other jurisdictions that require utilities to conduct such studies, and any frequency that those studies have to be completed by or at. So please go ahead.
Yeah, so a Minnesota law from this year requires a one-time study of highly constrained lines. So that's a start. But a California law from this year requires study of GETS every 2 years, according to a list of benefits. And that was one thing I wanted to raise is, you know, you sort of need to focus the study on a certain goal. So, it could be decreasing congestion, it could be increasing capacity for new load or generation. But I think having a list of a few things that the study should prioritize makes sure that all the potential values are touched. And so you could look at SB 1006 in California. That's now a law that lists out those requirements, but also FERC order number 1920 requires grid enhancing technologies in transmission planning and in order 1000 transmission planning processes, which I know going to show my ignorance, but I think in most regions are every couple of years. Let's see, did I cover? I think I covered everything. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Asher, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. First, I want to second the comments of both Ms. Selker and Mr. Milosevic. In addition to the legislation that Ms. Selker just mentioned, Maine also passed a study bill that requires studying within all rate making and grid planning proceedings for utilities that are subject to the Maine Public Utilities Commission. Massachusetts just last week approved a similar bill as well. It is awaiting governor's signature, but that is generally expected by the end of the year. And then excuse me, Virginia also passed a bill this year that requires utilities to include a comprehensive assessment of GETS applications within an IRP process. So there is some precedent from legislation that has been passed this year that will then be enacted for folks to pull on. In addition to that, I will just say in general, yes, I think a commission requirement for utilities to conduct these periodic assessments for both technical and economic potential would be a great next step. Echo the comments of Mr. Milosevic that it should apply likely to the IOUs and perhaps also the co-ops. It could be structured to apply to utilities that exceed potentially a certain size of customers or a certain amount of load. I would argue every 2 to 3 years would be a reasonable approach to study. However, another thing I will note is, in general, I think aligning this type of study to be part of an existing utility process usually makes things a little bit smoother for the utility seeking to implement it. And so to the extent that the timing of these studies could also align with existing utility processes, that might allow those studies to be more robust and therefore, and also to be directly included within these broader planning processes. And I think that's all I had on this question. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Asher. You're a font of citations, I guess. Wonder if, in addition to the things I asked you for earlier, you could just include either a citation or a link or a document to Maine, Virginia, and what was the other state? And Massachusetts.
Yep, I've got a list handy, and I will send that over to you following this call. Thanks.
Great. I appreciate that. Thanks very much. Let's see. Mr. Rambo from Black Hills, please go ahead. Mr. Rambo, I'm not hearing you. You may be muted. Looks like you're unmuted now, so please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So yeah, sorry about that. Just thinking about how this impacts Black Hills Energy. So in general, we haven't seen a lot of congestion problems on our system. And so we don't see the same issues with getting power to our customers as some of the larger utilities do. And I just wonder if it makes sense to impact the Black Hills Energy ratepayers if really there's not as much of a benefit from this type of analysis for a system that doesn't see the same congestion concerns. And I guess more broadly, to me, it seems like a lot of times it makes more sense to evaluate these ATTs on a individual project basis and using them as an opportunity to fix a specific problem, looking at a specific line that's congested.
Understood. Would you say that, I mean, if it could be shown that there is cost-effective application for ATT in the Black Hills service area, aside from, you know, an individual looking at an individual project that's being conducted for other purposes, that might provide, I mean, would you argue that there's no opportunity to provide ratepayer savings through assessing potential on the Black Hills system?
Yeah, I guess if there was a study proving that there was a benefit, I mean, obviously we'd be interested, but I guess the part that I don't quite understand is if you're not trying to address a specific issue such as congestion or an overload on an existing transmission line, I don't quite understand how you would show a benefit to that system.
Okay, well, I agree that there may likely be less value on the Black Hills system than a system like public service, but I think it remains to be seen whether there's insufficient value to justify, for instance, the cost of the study itself. But I take your comments. I appreciate them. I think I want to move along because we're running a little bit behind, actually. So, Mr. Escher, maybe you'll have a opportunity in a few minutes to make your point. But at this point, I think I'm going to keep us moving along. So sorry about that, but here we go. Let's try this. Here we go. So this is the, here's what I proposed without the benefit of the discussion we just had. So I'm going to ask folks to take a moment to review the language I'm showing here, and then let's discuss any additional comments on what you'd recommend for any adopted rules regarding an ATT potential study. Also, I'll note that in the deck I circulated, I had inadvertently omitted controllable load from this list, but of course, what the list would be any list that showed up under this rule, if it were adopted, would reflect the list that we discussed earlier. Yes, Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
Actually, in addition to my comments on the previous slide, but very relevant here is just reminding of Bruce Yoshida's point about studying the system under the unusual conditions that happen all the time. So requiring the study of any planned outages in this economic potential study would be a very important addition.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, I guess everyone's talked out on this subject. So then I guess, once if we were to all right, before we move on, Mr. Milosevic, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just going to give others a chance to go first. So I guess a few points. One is, sort of, as I previously mentioned, it would be beneficial to have as much of the Colorado transmission system involved in the study as possible. Perhaps it shouldn't be limited by utility size, but the cost could be apportioned according to the customer base, and then ideally Tri-State would participate as well. I would think knowing the answer to the question would be of interest to their customers. I'm happy to see that staff is central to designing the study and choosing consultants to carry out. I'd recommend as much staff authority as possible. I also think it would be advantageous if there was a step for meaningful stakeholder input, because there are stakeholders. This call is evidence that there are stakeholders with good ideas and substantial knowledge about ATT that could contribute. So I hope there's a role for stakeholders to at least comment. I'd also ask whether 100 kV is the best threshold to consider, because often 69 kV lines are a bottleneck or a constraint. And so perhaps all lines that are considered to be either transmission or sub-transmission should be studied. Regarding the ATT list, I'd recommend it, modifying it as suggested earlier. I guess that goes without saying. Let's see. Finally, I think that the ATT study, that should be in a rule, that the ATT study, the results of it should be filed in an appropriate proceeding so that it's available to stakeholders in the public.
Okay, thanks very much. I believe Mr. Flores is next. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dan. Gilbert Flores, Excel Energy. Hey, just a quick question, and I might have figured out the answer here, but on what time horizon would this particular study be conducted? And maybe that's just inserted there into the development of the scope of work. But the reason I ask is just because some of the technology you have listed there, are more, preferred use cases would be different times of year, right? So I'll just stick with dynamic line ratings being very dependent on something you could consider like the 10-day forecast or something, right? So it would be very difficult to implement that or understand what the results of that would be in a 10 or 20-year horizon. So that's why I was curious about the time frame. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So that is, I may not be understanding the question well enough to give you a good response, but I think the time horizon for the study would be, I think the idea here is to look at the existing system. Look, are there opportunities for, cost-effective savings that maintain reliability? I think that's an important addition here. On the existing system, the assessment of what's cost-effective would need to look at and maybe that's your question, like how far into the future are we determining benefits? Is that what you're asking?
Right. That's the basis there. So, in basic, the TPL analysis requirement, we look at 2-year cases, 5-year cases, and then 10-year cases for violations or potential issues on the system. And, that will include something further out into the future as Order 1920 gets rolled out. But so from a planning perspective, if we find an issue that's beginning to materialize in a 5-year case and it gets worse in a 10-year case, I think, some of the technologies discussed here could defer that, but it's more of a balance between if we are going to spend the funding and our customers funding there and provide a new project, does it make sense to provide that long-term capacity, because we do that 10-year horizon, and then in the future we'll do a 20-year horizon. And so if we see these things coming along, is it not best to have a more permanent solution pursued? So that's why I was going with that question. But thanks, Dan.
Gotcha. Yeah, and later on we'll talk about. I think the last issue I wanted to have a discussion about was kind of whether it would make sense in certain applications to have to consider an ATT as a temporary solution while while a longer term solution is being designed and built. But that's towards the end of our workshop today. So, I mean, I think that's a good question. You know, how would you determine cost effectiveness of ATT? How far into the future do you, include benefits? And we heard earlier of the analysis conducted in the SPP case where benefits within the course of a year were sufficient to offset the costs of implementation. I would imagine we'd want to look a minimum of 5 years forward in terms of determining benefits from a deployment of ATT, but it might be necessary to go 10 years out. I would put that to participants if anyone has any thoughts about that question. In the meantime, Mr. Brame, please go ahead.
Mr. Milosevic is much more eloquent and concise than I am, but I just want to echo his points about subtransmission at least going down to 69 kV. We think that's probably pretty significant, and we're seeing that in other potential rules and legislation.
Thank you. And as a vendor of carbon core conductors, I would imagine the vast majority of the applications you look at are shorter lines, and probably in the 69 to maybe 230 kV range. Is that accurate?
Our sweet spot is actually 69 to 345, and there's a misconception that advanced conductors are primarily for shorter lines. We have several 100-mile long lines. Just a quick background, we have about 120,000 miles up in the air around the world. Unfortunately, about less than 10,000 in the U.S., which is a challenge and why we engage in venues such as this.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
Hi, just to answer your question about how far ahead out benefits should be calculated, perhaps not a helpful answer, but I think per my point about considering planned outages, those are on a 1 or 2 year timescale, and the GETS deployment might pay for itself in the course of the several months that outage is taken. And there might be GETS deployments that pay for themselves over the course of years. So just the variation is large, and recommend that any study acknowledge that.
Thank you. All right. Okay, well, let's move along here. If we were to move ahead with this study or these studies, then the next question is what to do about them. Next questions I have are whether, when, and how to capitalize on any cost-effective potential that is demonstrated. I have 3 questions for discussion here. If a study indicates the existence of economically beneficial applications of ATT on the grid, and by the way, I think there's, and somebody may want to comment on this, I'm using ATT as a pretty broad bucket, including GETS and advanced conductors. If there's, I'm not sure we're all agreeing on the terminology here, so if I've got that wrong, I'd love it if somebody could set me straight. But I think, anyway, so if we're finding, if a study finds that there's economically beneficial ATT for the existing grid, should the commission require development of an ATT implementation plan in which such applications are prioritized? Should the commission establish a rule, by rule, the period over which economically, sorry about that, economically beneficial applications are required? And should the commission establish or allow for shared savings mechanisms to encourage the acquisition of economically beneficial applications? So I'd invite folks to reply to any or all of those questions. Yeah, Mr. Sushita, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Before we get on to the first one, I think every utility has a tariff, and within the tariff, there may be restrictions on what technology they can use. So, for example, the Southwest Power Pool that we talked about a lot today is looking at its tariff and trying to figure out which ATTs they can implement today versus what has to come after they make the tariff change. So there's that step. But once it is proven to be beneficial, I think the commission should encourage the utilities to implement it. And part of that encouragement can come from the shared savings mechanism. I don't know if enforcing is a good way of doing things because the study could be wrong, or the utility may have better ways of doing it because the way the utilities develop long-term plans, in my opinion, in my understanding, is that they don't necessarily look for the lowest cost, but they look for the biggest benefits. And so the lowest cost and the biggest benefits may not match. And in that case, if you enforce it just because it's the lowest cost, that may hinder the utilities planning. On the other hand, the utility should really consider it, and the commission having a shared saving mechanisms or some other mechanisms that encourage the utilities to utilize these economically beneficial applications is, in my mind, a very key piece that's kind of potentially missing from today's world.
Thanks very much. Mr. Milosevic, please go ahead.
Let's see. So I guess, yes, I think a rule requiring utilities to submit an implementation plan for adopting economically beneficial ATT is necessary in order to ensure that this is more than just a box checking exercise. Sometimes that's what Rule 3627 transmission plans, in part at least, feel like. And we want to avoid that if there are opportunities that they should be taken advantage of. And it probably makes sense that the plan should include a thoughtful proposed order of prioritization of different actions. And regarding a timeline, there should be one in order to avoid never-ending delay, but it's hard to choose a time frame not knowing how extensive the identified opportunities may be. Perhaps there's a way to specify a staged approach based on the prioritized list of economically beneficial actions. And the timeline could also consider typical lead times needed to implement each action. And I have more comments too about the shared savings mechanism, but I'll set those aside for a moment and give others a chance.
Okay, I appreciate it. Others don't seem to be availing themselves of the chance. Yeah, Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
I'll just quickly say that the development of an implementation plan is part of the Minnesota legislation that I mentioned. Of course, it just passed this year, so we'll see it in action soon. But I'll throw it out that that's something others have put in place.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, I think people are getting worn out here. I'm not sure, but or perhaps, well, okay, I won't characterize that further. Why don't we just move along, since I'm not seeing any other hands up. Mr. Milosevic, if you have just a brief additional comment, you can go ahead, and then we'll go to Mr. Ashby.
Well, I wanted to say a few things about the shared savings mechanism. I think it's a great idea, perhaps along the lines of what that has been proposed to FERC by Grid Strategies. But I think it's important that the carrot also be accompanied by the stick, or it won't be effective. One factor which applies to GETS more than to the other ATT is that utilities are incentivized to not implement GETs, because GETs are not capital investments that earn a return. So they'd rather solve transmission needs with new transmission to the greatest extent possible. And a shared savings incentive would cushion the blow of implementing less lucrative solutions. However, even with the incentive, it's still less profitable than traditional transmission solutions. So it's important that implementation of identified ATT solutions be mandatory by rule. The carrot of shared savings is not so much to entice utilities to get on board with GETs and ATT, but to entice them to be more cooperative than they might otherwise be with the stick alone. And finally, I just suggest that terms like economically beneficial and cost-effective need to be defined in the rules in order to identify things that should and should not be included in an economic assessment. For example, energy efficiency should be included because carbon core conductor has substantially lower line losses than ACSR, and that's a huge benefit to ratepayers over the lifetime of a conductor. Similarly, avoided costs should be included, like the reuse of existing towers for reconductoring with advanced conductor. Buffering and time shifting transmitted energy with storage both increases the utilization of transmission assets and allows for arbitrage benefits, and that should be included too. So those are just some examples of cost-effective and economic beneficial need some specificity, I think.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Mr. Asher.
Yeah, thanks. I'll echo most of the comments that have been shared on this question so far. Certainly support the commission requiring this implementation plan. A couple of points. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to kind of streamline what this approach would look like, where, you know, right now it seems like it's essentially contemplated that there would be first this cost effectiveness assessment that would seemingly be submitted, potentially subject to approval. I don't recall if you had determined whether it would be subject to approval, but then followed by an implementation plan. And if there is potentially a way to combine the two and essentially do a cost effectiveness assessment, and then utilities would include within this same, call it an ATT report or whatever you might call it, also an implementation plan to deploy the investments that are deemed to be the most cost effective. And again, I do think that kind of goes back to an issue that I think it was Mr. Milosevic who raised, that it's a little bit hard to determine which, how many projects could reasonably be included in that in a specified time frame, given that we don't yet know the results of a cost effectiveness assessment. But if there's a way to kind of kill two birds and do a cost effectiveness assessment and deploy projects where they are deemed to be cost effective and perhaps where they're not, the utility would, explain their rationale as to why under specific circumstances of a project, it might not be cost effective. Like if there's going to be an upgrade in the near term, maybe there's a way to kind of streamline that process. Alternatively, I do think, a cost effectiveness study and then an implementation plan does make sense. And then I'll just also support the idea of a carrot on top of a stick. I think, incentives can be very valuable. The UK created an incentive through its RIO framework, whereby shared savings were structured so that only when ratepayers receive a quantifiable benefit, then the utility is able to earn that incentive. I believe it was structured to be around 10% of the benefit would then go to the utility who deployed as an incentive. So that is certainly a structure that we would support the commission establishing or exploring.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asher. And Mr. Flores, please go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Hey, Dan. Gilbert Flores, Xcel Energy. So I won't get into the bullets, but just wanted to touch on the economic benefit and, absent any parameters around that, it would be a little difficult to do that comparison. And I guess I'm curious, for cost effective project selection, I guess, would that boil down to the costs of an ATT versus a traditional long-term capacity expansion project. And then I think something that should also be considered in that is the time frame. So, you know, the age of particular projects, excuse me, not the age, but the life expectancy of certain transmission projects. You know, it's in the multi-decades, whereas some of the other technologies may become rather obsolete or need replacing within a shorter time frame. So I think that should be considered when you're making that that comparative analysis there. And then I think just one last point, I wanted to touch on something that Ken was, I believe, pointing out is absent the traditional market and parameters associated with that. I think, you know, the system here lacks the, say, like the LMPs and the price differentials across different constraints to settle on an actual value of benefits. I think that's what he was trying to point out, is that there isn't that market trigger or the market signal to then show that value discreetly. So thanks.
Yeah, I think with regard to your earlier point, it seems to me that we're thinking in different types of projects. I mean, to me, this is primarily, if not exclusively, about looking at portions of the bulk of the transmission system that is not otherwise being touched. Looking at opportunities to improve the existing transmission system, and sure, in a CPCN process, I think, and we discussed this in the first workshop on rule changes to the existing 3627 and CPCN rules. We had a bit of a discussion about the requirements for the evaluation of alternatives in the course of proceedings, CPCN proceedings for new transmission assets. So, but here we're really looking at the existing transmission system with the potential to improve its efficiency. So I just wanted to make that clear, because from your comments, I think you were really talking about application of ATT to new assets. And then I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, and no question that we don't have locational marginal prices in the state as of yet. That's something that's forthcoming, and I suppose if and when, and we know that Tri-State's joining SPP remains to be seen for Black Hills and Excel. Assuming they do join an ISO RTO, then those transmission decisions, any rules that we would implement here regarding evaluation of advanced technologies would presumably be moot, or else they would be conversation that state participants would have with the relevant ISO. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any more hands up at the moment, so let's just take a look at this again, without the benefit of this conversation we've had regarding actually implementing ATT potential. I drafted up a proposed rule, which you see here. Hopefully that's large enough, or people have had the opportunity to look at it in advance of the workshop. I'd ask for any additional comments on this proposed language. Mr. Asher, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Overall, I think this is really excellent, laid out well. It's a clear study approach. So I don't think I have any material comments on A through E. I will make a comment on item F, though. I would caution against utilizing a symmetrical shared savings mechanism. Symmetrical essentially being both upside and downside, meaning a utility can receive an incentive and the utility could also receive a penalty. I would certainly be curious to maybe better understand the thought behind the penalty aspect, but I would assume the structure would essentially be and Mr. Greenberg, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I would assume it would kind of the metric, if it was likely based on congestion relief. So if congestion is reduced, there's upside and therefore an incentive, and therefore if congestion is not relieved, then there would be a penalty or a disincentive. And I would just if that assumption is true, then I would kind of caution against that, only because it seems like the deployments would be determined based on the study. And if the study ultimately deems something to be cost effective, but then once it's deployed, it doesn't necessarily result in the congestion relief, that could ultimately result in overall disincentivizing utilities from doing any ATT deployments at all. And I think that's kind of a potentially risky approach. I'll specifically highlight for a technology like dynamic line ratings, what we see through Line Vision's deployments, about 95% of the time on average, there are capacity gains. However, there are times where capacity we realize that often the capacity of a line is overrated or overstated, excuse me. And therefore the line is overrated. And so in those instances, we would argue that increased line rating accuracy is a benefit that directly impacts reliability. And specifically thinking about, in instances where utilities are essentially running lines to too high of a rating, that can result in faster annealing of the conductor. And so there is essentially there is a reliability benefit provided even when DLR, for example, identifies that there is actually less capacity available on the system and lines are being rated too high. And so I would just worry about if a symmetrical incentive, meaning including downside, including a penalty, was included, that might kind of ultimately have a negative effect when even at times when congestion is not relieved, there's still a reliability benefit. And then I'll also just add, in terms of structuring a shared savings mechanism, a generally common approach in the performance-based rate-making world is to utilize a deadband, whereby if just for example, if congestion changes 0 to 10%, there would be no incentive. But if congestion changes 10 to 25%, there could be, you could even structure it as like a tiered approach. So if it's a 10 to 25% of congestion relief, perhaps there's 5% of the savings go back to a utility. If it's 25 to 50%, 10% of savings go back to the utility. And I won't go all the way up to 100, but I think that the point is hopefully clear. So yeah, just wanted to provide some thoughts on what maybe the structure of a shared savings mechanism could look like.
Okay, thank you. I think my motivation in putting that word symmetrical in there is, to avoid cases where projects are implemented in ways that don't provide savings, but only net costs to consumers, and just trying to avoid that particular situation. I'll ask others to chime in on that point that Mr. Asher made. But in the meantime, Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything Mr. Asher just said. And I think a shared savings incentive relies on a counterfactual, which is probably easiest to make when you have a planned transmission upgrade that is no longer needed. And that's a situation where the incentive for GETs is truly out of line, because GETs are going to be low cost and implemented very quickly, and a traditional upgrade is going to be very expensive and have that return on equity incentive for the utility. So in those cases where a utility can show, we're adopting this new technology that we haven't used before, for instance, and we're going to put it here, here, and here, and it will save ratepayers this much money, then a shared savings incentive for that kind of proposal, I think makes sense. If it's a $200 million transmission plans or in transmission upgrades that have been avoided, the ratepayer savings are going to be substantial, and they're not in question. I think when you get to more expensive upgrades like high performance reconductoring, if you try to put a potential penalty on using this technology, that will actually further disincentivize the utilities from deploying them, because needs on the transmission system, Mr. Tushita already made this point, change faster than transmission gets built sometimes. And so I would be concerned if there was a potential penalty in place if the deployment doesn't pay for itself, even if on paper ahead of time it looked like it would, because these sorts of things happen, and that's just the situation with building for 5 or 6 or 10 years in the future. Not every investment is going to have the same cost benefit as you thought it was at the outset. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Milosevic, please go ahead.
Yeah, I had a few comments on the proposed rule. As with the ATT study, I'd recommend including a meaningful role for both staff and stakeholders to comment on the submitted implementation plan. For best results and given the potential for major impact on the transmission system and on ratepayers, perhaps this implementation plan should even be litigated. Regarding item C, many ATT projects will be faster to implement than traditional transmission projects. And I would think that a timeline much shorter than 4 years is in order for the high priority projects, with the possible exceptions of reconductoring with advanced conductor and some elements of distribution level measures, and energy storage may have longer lead times, but GETS could probably be implemented easily in 2 years. Regarding item D, you might consider adding a phrase along the lines of, and a narrative description of reliability, resilience, and other system benefits that may not be readily quantifiable in monetary terms. And regarding item E, it should probably be more clear where this independent assessment could come from. The ATT study itself presumably includes an assessment of economic benefits, but it may only be partially relevant to implementation. So the question is, would this be a separately commissioned assessment? And would it be conducted by the contractor that conducted the study, or perhaps by commission economists? I don't know, but it should probably be more clear. And finally, on item F, yeah, I too question whether the symmetrical designation applies here as it does with other PIMs like on Power Pathway or the ERP. The term shared savings kind of implies that the payout is a percentage of verified savings. And if the, let's see, if the savings end up being higher or lower than originally expected, then the payout would be proportionally higher or lower than originally expected. And again, the shared savings mechanism probably shouldn't apply to all types of ATT, especially not to items that are capital investments that already earn a return, or that should be just expected as a normal part of the utility's job. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right. And I'm not seeing any further hands up. I appreciate everybody's perspectives on that. Okay. Then the next subject would be how to prioritize any ATT projects that are opportunities that are shown to be cost effective. First question is, should grid optimization be a required part of the planning process for all transmission projects, whether new build, reconstruction, reconductoring, wildfire mitigation, or another purpose. And then secondly, are there certain types of transmission projects that should remain exempt from grid optimization considerations? And if so, what are they and why should they be exempt? Any takers on these questions? Any input? I'd be particularly interested in input from any utility participants today. Yes, Mr. Asher, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can start. Overall, I think yes, including grid optimization within part of the planning process makes sense. Speaking to the second question, the wildfire aspect is the one, wildfire mitigation is the one aspect that I've just been kind of wondering if that truly fits under like an optimization category. Not totally clear to me what optimizing for wildfire mitigation would look like in practice. And I guess I would have a worry that it could create a construct that results in over-investing in wildfire mitigation, just in that, you know, once you get to some level of investment, and I can't say what that level is specifically, there would be diminishing returns for, you know, every dollar spent would have less and less of a benefit. At a certain point, you'd get to kind of a plateau, more or less. In general, certainly think the grid, you know, there should be an aim to protect the grid from wildfires as much as is reasonably possible. But just kind of recognizing the aspect of cost effectiveness in that vein. But yeah, overall, otherwise, I think grid optimization falling within the planning process does make sense.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, well, okay. We are getting a lot of participation from vendors and independent citizens here on this discussion, and I would like to open it up to others if anyone else is interested in making comments in this area. All right, I think we're going to, okay. Yeah, I think now I'm seeing Mr. Rambo from Black Hills. Please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think most of these technologies don't need to be considered for projects that are driven by aging infrastructure. If you have structures that are reaching their end of life and need to be replaced anyway, I don't think it makes sense to consider some of these technologies. I can see the idea of considering advanced conductors for projects like that, maybe, but for the most part, I think most of those technologies wouldn't make sense as an alternative to a project driven by aging infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fidrick, and please correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name.
No, you got it right. So I think one of the important aspects that we need to keep in consideration is sometimes GETs or ATTs don't address some of these reliability-based needs that we've identified in the transmission planning process. For example, what if you have parallel paths that serve, you know, a load pocket, and that load pocket is really subject to, you know, voltage collapse under certain scenarios. GETs would not necessarily address that issue. It would potentially allow for, you know, an increased transmission capacity, but maybe not that load serving capability when it's really, when you look at it in terms of megawatts and voltage, and you have that curve that shows the relationship. Maybe you're on that nose of that curve, and an additional transmission capacity on an existing line just doesn't solve that problem. So that's one scenario where a GETS or ATT isn't the solution. So really keeping that in mind, it is a something that should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and the need really should be there and addressed by this. The second thing I think that we should keep in mind too is some of these ATTs, we consider them at times to be really more focused on the operational or real-time solutions, and there's something that we can leverage in the near term and to provide us that additional capacity or reliability until a more well thought out scoped project, if one is needed, has that opportunity to arise. And then that would also allow for that coordination between stakeholders and neighboring entities.
And stakeholders, and did you say neighboring entities?
Yeah, so like for example, Tri-State, one of their neighbors is Excel or Black Hills or whatever other utility, or maybe it's a different partner somewhere else. It really depends on where the need is and what the scope of a project would be for what you're trying to address.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Neal, please go ahead.
I wanted to respond to Trevor's comment about ATTs are not to consider for aging equipment, but when you're going to replace that old line, then you want to consider ATT for the new line, particularly advanced conductors on that new replacement line.
Right. Mr. Rambo, if you'd like to reply, that's please do so. But I was thinking along the same lines that when you're replacing aging equipment, it might be a great opportunity to look at opportunities for opportunity. Maybe a great occasion to consider alternate conductors. So, Mr. Rambo, I see your hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. I think there's an opportunity to look at advanced conductors. I think most of the other technologies on the list wouldn't make sense to evaluate for a project like that.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Lunar, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll preface this by saying I don't think that this is a consensus viewpoint among the participants on the call. But again, this is where I'd like to point out that some differentiation between grid optimization investments that focus on improving the operation of the grid on the real-time basis probably need a different consideration from those that are kind of those long-term capacity enhancement investments. To the point of evaluating whether an advanced conductor is appropriate for a rebuilt line. We think that's clearly in the scope of what's required today. And this is an example on a new line, but it kind of demonstrates how that analysis is done. The study that we published in the pathway proceeding on kind of evaluating the cost effectiveness by considering the relative costs and benefits of different conductor types. That methodology, we think, has some potential for being able to demonstrate how conductor selections are made. But reconstructing an existing line because it's reached its end of life is probably more akin to constructing a new line than it is to whether or not you would deploy DLR to, in certain instances, increase the capacity of that line. So I'm a little concerned about these all being kind of blanket lumped together as you're going to consider grid optimization, unless the utilities have kind of the discretion to come in and make the case of which optimizations are actually relevant use cases for the problem at hand. Because our answer is probably going to be something along the lines of topology optimization is never going to be a viable solution for a line that needs to be rebuilt due to age. So we would just want to make sure that there's a recognition that these different technologies each have their own unique use cases, and that the consideration shouldn't be blanket, or you're going to either get every proceeding is going to turn into litigating with other parties, whether we have correctly and accurately understood the use case of these technologies, rather than focusing our efforts on where there might actually be opportunities for some new technology to truly enhance the value of what's being done.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lunar. And there's a piece of I have proposed rule for assessing and implementing or capitalizing on ATT potential that I'm not showing in the slide deck today, where I've suggested that exactly what you're talking about, that there may be particular use cases that a technical potential study could focus on for any given technology. But I do appreciate your comments there. Mr. Tsuchida, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think there's one thing I wanted to point it out. Obviously, ATTs alone will not be a good replacement for replacing aging facilities. But then I think that's the wrong comparison. Perhaps the proper comparison should be simply replacing an aging facility with in-kind versus in-kind plus ATT. Because in many cases, the cost of the ATT falls within the range of errors of cost estimates that is provided by the utility. And many studies will show that the cost of the ATTs are really, really low, but the benefits, even just the situational awareness that the ATTs may bring, is well worth it. So I think the comparison here saying can ATT replace wires is the wrong notion. Perhaps the more better way to do it is how can ATTs, if implemented, complement with the new wires or the existing transmission projects?
Thanks very much. Do you have and I think you were suggesting, I think an example of, I think what you had in mind was DLR, where you have greater awareness of line rating. So you would implement it at the same time that you'd be reconductoring or installing a new line. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Ruiz, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I wanted to second Mr. Tushida's comments on that, and in particular, regarding the use of topology optimization for different type of applications, including rebuilds. Sometimes the benchmark is of comparison with the just a rebuild may not be the right one. But rather what the technology can do is inform what differences in the design, for example, of a substation could be warranted. So rather than rebuilding in kind, perhaps providing additional transmission flexibility so that then that could be leveraged in operations. There were a number of comments before indicating the value of these technologies in operations. So it's important to account for how would they behave in operations in a planning context, so that flexibility is actually built into the system. So one very simple example could be if there's an aging substation which has a single bus type of design which affords pretty much no flexibility. There could be benefits of rebuilding in a different type of configuration, a breaker and a half ring or some other configuration, to justify that other than just company policy. to justify that additional investment when we need to do a study in for example, a topology optimization study with Informit.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yes, Mr. Milosevic, please go ahead.
I think there are two answers to this question that are both true. As far as the Rule 3627 planning process that focuses on like one or a handful of projects to meet a particular identified grid need, then first of all, I'd say, yes, the updated Rule 3627 and CPCN rules should require that grid optimization utilizing ATT be considered as transmission alternatives, which has been the Commission's recommendation in the most recent two Rule 3627 decisions. But the point is well taken that, if there's like a radial line that needs to serve, load and requires 50% capacity increase, no, none of the gets are going to help, but maybe it is an opportunity for advanced reconductoring, or maybe the constraint is only for an hour a day and it's an opportunity for putting storage on one or both ends of the line. And those things should be considered. So I do think it belongs in the rules of traditional transmission planning. However, I'd answer differently when considering the more general sense of a holistic grid optimization study and implementation plan that we've been discussing here. In addition to the ongoing transmission planning process, I view holistic grid optimization as a strategy really that underlies and benefits all future transmission planning and transmission operations and wildfire mitigation, et cetera. In that an optimized grid would provide a superior and more efficient baseline for planning and operations than the current far from optimal grid. Right now, in many cases, such as load serving or reliability projects, we don't really know whether a given transmission project is truly needed or whether the need is just a consequence of a century of piecemeal growth of the grid that resulted in an inefficient use of grid assets, where a more optimized system might obviate the need for that project at all. I guess the bottom line of this comment is that grid optimization should be a consideration for all individual transmission projects, but a holistic system-wide optimization study and implementation plan is in a different league of importance as it corrects first century of suboptimal growth of the grid and would impact all future transmission planning as well as operations, and should therefore be given a high priority to accomplish on an expedited timeframe.
Thanks very much. And I was about to ask for any utility response to those points that Mr. Milosevic is raising. I don't know if that's why you raised your hand, Mr. Flores, but please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Greenberg, and I appreciate the conversation here. I just wanted to point out that long-term planning I think is separate from the real-time planning and operational studies that take place on the next day system, right? So I think there's a set of planners out there that are evaluating operational constraints, construction outages, and are constantly asking, the what if questions for the next 24 hours. And then using that analysis, provide some pre-planned situational actions that they might take to put the system in its best position for reliability. And essentially, somebody mentioned that from before, the reliability component is paramount, I think, for the transmission operators here. So when we begin to discuss topology optimization in terms of opening and closing lines to reroute power, I think it really puts us in a position where now we have a less integrated system and pieces of the network are opened due to maybe economic reasons or something like that. And then you run into weather, you have something unplanned outage that occurs, and now you're kind of on the back foot trying to respond to that. So just wanted to point out some of that we do conduct that optimization exercise. It's not perhaps utilizing the particular softwares here represented, but even in long-term planning, we do look at load balancing and reconfigurations of different routes to determine if we could, encourage power flow to go different directions, moving lines in and out of substations and that sort of thing. That all is part of our consideration to make best use of the grid. So just want to give you that bit of information and detail, and happy to answer any questions if you got them. Thanks.
Thank you. I do want to follow up on that a little bit, and I wonder, others may as well. But my understanding is that topology optimization software presents to the grid operator a variety of different solutions or different responses to potential contingencies in more or less real time. So I wonder whether it might actually be a boon to the operators, because now they have better ability to visualize actions that they could take if load goes in a certain direction, or if there's a contingency on the grid. That's my perception, but that perception is pretty limited. So happy to hear from others about that as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, Mr. Flores, if you had a reaction to that, please go ahead.
Well, I guess my reaction was I didn't understand if are you assuming they don't have that level of visibility, or that this would be some sort of improvement on top of what they have today, because there is visibility.
Sure, of course.
My
Yeah,
response.
no. Yeah, I think, you wouldn't do it if it didn't provide some kind of benefit like that, providing enhanced understanding of options that are available in real time, more or less real time. But
right.
Okay.
Yep. I think it's there is some benefit there, and whether or not the particular piece of software equipment aligns here, there is that what would you call it, piece of technology available for those individuals in the control center. Yep.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point, why don't we take a 15-minute break and come back at quarter to four. Thanks very much. All right, everyone, why don't we resume our meeting? Just a couple more issues to go out over this afternoon. And next up is optimization versus gold plating. I just wanted to have a bit of a discussion on how the commission and parties could recognize and prevent what I call gold plating. I think you know what I mean, in proposed optimization projects. As we discussed earlier, I'm proposing language that would require independent savings verification for optimization projects. But what other thoughts do you have in this area that might find its way into the rules? Or is this not a concern from your perspective? Or should this not be in rule, this kind of consideration not be in the rules at all, but rather considered in the course of a CPCN proceeding? I just want to tee up that question for you. Mr. Lunar, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jared Lunar with Public Service again. We think that this is something that's probably a good line of inquiry to leave into a CPCN proceeding, and ultimately trying to judge the appropriateness of any one project is really going to come down to the assumptions that you make and the time horizons you're testing those assumptions on. And again, I'll go back to talking about a potential new facility here. But we think that our proposal for the 20-year transmission plan can help validate the durability of planned projects over a longer time horizon. By doing that additional analysis, by doing it on a 20-year horizon, you can test whether the facility is appropriately sized relative to the need that triggered that facility to be constructed in the first place. And you can judge whether it's potentially oversized or undersized based on that. And I think this concept of future proofing is something that is already addressed to some extent in CPCNs. For example, when we bring forward a recommendation for a new line, we might state that we're going to operate it at 230 kV initially, but construct it for a quick and easy conversion to 345 kV. We think that these additional transmission planning looks will help give the commission and other stakeholders that participate in these proceedings a better view into what the assumptions were that led to that decision being made, and help maybe even start to identify the conditions under which that conversion would take place in the future, to help decide whether that investment in the additional capability is worth it today or whether it should be deferred to the future. So really, we think that this is already kind of the bread and butter purpose of a CPCN proceeding, is to evaluate the assumptions that led to a project being proposed, and test whether the design aligns with those assumptions.
Thanks very much. Appreciate your comment. Mr. Wilson.
Ken Wilson with COSA. I want to support what Jared just said. I agree. I'm much more interested in the 10 and 20-year plans, especially the 20-year plan as Jared and Excel have proposed. I think that's a great starting point for improvement of the rules. While I'm very interested in the long-term use of advanced transmission technology, and I will submit to this docket the comments that I wrote for NRDC on dynamic line rating, basically saying that all transmission lines should have dynamic line rating in the 20-year time frame for visibility into the grid, because we don't have that now. But I'll save the rest of my comments really for the commission on these subjects, rather than getting into additional arguments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts that either agree or disagree with what Mr. Lunar or Mr. Wilson have said on this? This is gold plating something that we need to be concerned about, or as Mr. Lunar suggests, is the CPCN process sufficient as is to ensure that that doesn't happen? Mr. Milosevic, go ahead.
I think I largely agree with Mr. Lunar that hopefully the distinction between optimization and gold plating can be made by the commission on the basis of the utility's narrative and analysis that justifies the need for a chosen alternative and its characteristic. Either it's defensible or it's not. I guess if it's not, then the commission presumably has the authority to deny the project or to order modifications. And for sure, that authority should be clear in the rules so that if that's the case, the commission can act accordingly. I think I've noted earlier that Rule 3627 requires evaluation of transmission alternatives on the basis of best cost or best value, as opposed to least cost. And sometimes future proofing might be justified or justifiable. For example, in the case of using high capacity conductors or a wider right of way that might not be needed at the moment, as long as a convincing case can be made that in the 10 to 20 year time frame, widespread electrification will create the extra demand, and it's cheaper in the long run to design that in from the start. Alternatively, requiring projects to only meet the need at the moment in order to reduce immediate costs might, in some cases, be short-sighted and more expensive in the long run. But it should be incumbent on the utility to make a convincing case, and the commission should, should sanction a utility that repeatedly puts forth indefensible gold-plated projects. But I think it would be hard to make rules to try to prevent gold plating on looking at more than just looking at the case on a case-by-case basis. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Brim.
Yeah, I would only point out, just to add to the dialogue, that in the past, certainly the gold plating was a bit of an obstacle to the adoption of advanced conductors. There's certainly some evidence that that's less of an obstacle now, and maybe even less in the future as some of the additional benefits are being recognized. In the past, it was almost a preemptive disadvantage, because we saw some cases where utilities were simply reluctant to go before commission with advanced conductor solution because they were afraid of being accused of gold plating. And maybe hopefully that reluctance is going away, and we're seeing at least some evidence, at least in other states and other venues, that may be happening.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, so my impression is that this really, I think I tend to agree with what's been said and agreed to by the others that have spoken, that the place for this concern is really in the CPCN. So, and I'm not seeing any other hands up there, so I think we'll move to our last subject of the day. I had a few questions about the application of ATTs as interim solutions in cases where it appears that a more conventional solution is likely to be needed in the longer term. And first, I'm wondering if we have any developers or vendors participating today that could provide an example or two of such applications, situations where quickly deployable ATT solutions could provide a short-term relief while a longer-term solution is being built. Mr. Brame, your camera is on.
Oh, sorry. No, sorry.
Is that something you'd like to comment on?
No, I forgot to turn it off. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, it strikes me that there are probably such applications. Ms. Selker, please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, we have a list of these. I don't actually have them prepared off the top of my head, but in terms of an interim solution, DLR has been deployed, at least in Texas. There was a construction underway, and this example is actually from quite a long time ago. I don't remember the year. 2010 is when the presentation is from. There was a project in Texas where there were other lines coming into service in the future, but it would have also been cost effective, I think, to do a $20 million line upgrade just to serve that need in the interim. But real-time line ratings on that 138 kV line avoided the need for that rebuild. So that's one example. We have some examples of advanced power flow control that were used during outages to reduce costs. I'm not sure if I have a direct example of well, I suppose that is in a sense a short-term relief as a permanent solution. It was being constructed, right? It was a construction outage. So in one case, advanced power flow control saved $70 million over a 3.5-year outage period. And that's net savings. So those are two examples. I have a longer list that I think we can submit to the docket.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. I'd appreciate that. Okay, thank you. Mr. Rozek, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Parker Rozek, Xcel Energy again. Yeah, I just want to say that I agree that ATTs can be used for short-term relief. I think at Xcel, we've had some history of that using AAR, not necessarily DLR, but AAR on some to deal with outages and things like that, where we knew the temperatures were not going to be the static rating, right? It's fall. It's going to be.
Just in case anybody participating today isn't familiar with that, you're referring to ambient adjusted ratings, right?
Yes, yeah, correct. Ambient adjusted.
You're looking at ambient temperatures and providing a set of maybe static different static ratings at different temperatures. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Yes. So if your rating methodology says that it's 104 degrees, but it's only 70 degrees outside, using 70 degrees to allow more capacity, which effectively is what the FERC 881 is and will be across the grid everywhere. And then the next step being DLR. So we've done that in the past for short-term relief, sometimes with outages and things like that. And then a recent example as well is this is actually on an underground circuit, but underground circuits are really subjective to other heating elements, especially distribution and steam lines and other hot items. And so we had a circuit that was experiencing some excessive heat in the oil temperature, basically in the cable, and we installed I'll call it like a DLR light, maybe, because it's thermocouples on the pipe. But we installed some thermocouples to actually know the actual temperature of the cable system, allowing us to rate the conductor much higher than what the assumed ratings would be based on the computer methodology that's used for that type of stuff. So just some examples of what we've done, and just that we agree that this stuff, DLR, some other things can definitely be used to help while you figure out, is it just a short-term problem or is it a longer-term problem that needs a bigger solution?
Thank you. Mr. Asher.
Yeah, there are definitely a handful of public examples. We've talked a couple of times during this call about the SPP study in Oklahoma and Kansas that demonstrated a payback period of 6 months, which in general, and that's not, I think that was a study, so not as deployed solution, but in general underscores how quick or how short a payback period can be with GETS deployment. But I will point to two specific deployments that Line Vision did, both with AES Corporation across their Ohio and Indiana service territory. One where DLR delivered capacity gains at a cost of $45,000 per mile, which was deployed in 9 months, where they were alternatively considering reconductoring as a solution, which would have cost $590,000 per mile and would have taken 2 years to deploy. And then another line where we deployed with AES under the same deployment actually demonstrated that the line more often than not had an overstated capacity, where AES was ultimately able to determine through Line Vision's DLR deployment that they only needed to reconductor a 1/2 of a mile of a line as opposed to the entire line. So that obviously resulted in a much more targeted approach to reconductoring and therefore less cost, because they identified that the most limiting element in terms of the constraint was only that 1/2 mile stringing section of the line. And so they didn't need to reconductor the whole thing and could just do a much smaller segment. So that's another example of kind of quick quick options where DLR was able to identify a constraint or relieve constraints there, where they could then therefore reduce future permanent solutions or reduce the scope and cost of those permanent solutions.
Got it. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Mr. Galbraith.
Thank you, Dan. I wanted to weigh in on this idea. I think earlier the gentleman from Brattle spoke to the idea of keeping your options open as long as possible on large infrastructure investment, right? If you don't have to make a decision for another year, don't make a decision for another year, right? And ATTs do a wonderful job of extending those options and allowing you more time to investigate whether or not the really large infrastructure investments are the ones that you want to make. The world can change pretty quickly, and the idea of an optimized investment path is a fiction. The idea that you're going to identify investments that you're going to make over the next 20 years and that you're going to stick to that investment path is nuts, right? The world is going to change in 5 years, 10 years. What you really want to be making early on is investments that are flexible. So capacity additions that come in small increments and that can be built quickly, those create option value. People should look at what the Northwest Power Conservation Council does in estimating the dollar value from extending those options. So ATTs are beneficial because they extend options, they keep options open. You can obtain more information before you make those big dollar capital intensive investments, and they help you to avoid bad decisions. So I'm a big fan of ATTs in making short-term solutions and extending those options. And I think that the utilities and the commission really ought to look at the dollar value of extending those options into the future.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Next, it occurred to me that if ATT were deployed as a temporary solution, there might be significant value remaining in that technology once the longer term solution was in place. So my next question is, what should be done with the temporary solution once a permanent solution is in place? And, should it be retained by the utility? Should it be resold? Do ATT vendors even offer leasing options? Or is that something that might, if they don't currently, is that something that might be available in the future? Just wondering about, is it better for a utility to hang on to that solution, reuse it in the future? Yeah, Mr. Tsuchida, please go ahead.
Yes, first, I think it really depends on the type of ATT you're talking about. Software, what's the point of not keeping it if it works? So topology optimization software, as an example, you use it for one place, you can use it for other places. For dynamic line rating and other portable ATTs, they're portable. So it's not like you're building a new transmission line. You put on the sensors, you can take off the sensors and bring it elsewhere. So, the utility can retain it for future use or resell it. But remember, these guys, in many of the studies, tells us that the capital recovery period is months, if not lower number of years. So by the time the temporary solution is replaced with a permanent solution, it's already paid back in many cases. So then, do you want to keep it there? So dynamic line rating, do you want to keep it there for situational awareness, or do you want to move it elsewhere? I think that's a case by case. So I don't think we need to define what to do, because it's case by case and ATT by ATT.
Thank you. That makes sense to me. Mr. Escher, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'll second the comments of Mr. Tsuchida. That was all well put. Yeah, DLR. I'll speak just about DLR in this instance and about line vision. As we've talked about a couple times on this call, in addition to the general capacity gains that we often see, DLR provides enhanced reliability, situational awareness. There are DLR sensors out there that can help with wildfire mitigation elements, reduction of the frequency or scope of PSPS events. And so there are a handful of long-standing, longer-term benefits that DLR sensors can provide. As Mr. Tsujita noted, they also can potentially be repurposed to a new line as they are relatively portable. So a lot of gets, and I guess this refers, I think exactly what he said, this refers to some of the ATTs, primarily the grid enhancing technologies, which provide a lot of these long-term benefits in addition to the short-term ones. You brought up leasing options. I'll just speak about Line Vision's approach. That's not something that we have done in the past. None of our utility customers have requested a leasing style structure. However, if a customer did request it, it's something we would certainly entertain. I can't, confirm whether we would do it or not. But it is something we would be open to if a utility expressed interest in it. But we have not heard of anyone doing so.
Thank you for that. I'm just curious. I mean, DLR is probably I think the least expensive of the opportunities. Maybe I suppose topology optimization might be cheaper in some applications, but I'm wondering, and I'm not, this isn't specific to you, Mr. Asher, just wondering if there are other vendors on the line, or perhaps Ms. Selker, that could talk to whether other more capital intensive ATTs might, and I guess it certainly wouldn't be conductors, so let's say GETs, that might be where leasing might be a viable option. I'm just speculating here, so perhaps it's a bad speculation, but just wondering if that's been seen anywhere in the world or in this country.
Yeah, I don't have any examples right now, but I'll ask the membership of the Watt Coalition if they do have them. I think generally, to Mr. Tsushita's point, the value of DLR extends beyond just increasing transmission capacity, and the continuing situational awareness and monitoring can be more valuable than taking them down and putting them somewhere else, I think, in many cases. I think I can get back to you on other vendor models.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious if you find anything that would be helpful. Thanks very much. And last question, and I think given our conversation here, I think I know what folks would say about this, but are there any rules necessary to facilitate that kind of an approach? Mr. Braham, your hand went up just as I was asking that question. So I don't know if that's what you want to comment on, but
the previous, yeah. Just to advise the commission that I can't say that any have been deployed yet, although it may not be true. There are some innovative financing solutions being looked at in some locales and some utilities. Third-party financing that might, that provide lease type options for, I assume, all GETs, but I know for sure for advanced conductors even. So it's not clear that this will be a large scale, but there is some surprising discussion on that, particularly with the need for capital to come into the industry. And also wanted to comment on Mr. Asher's comment earlier. Generally what he said I think is accurate, but he did say there's an alternative or is a faster solution to reconductoring. I would only question whether that was advanced reconductoring or reconductoring with more traditional, reconductoring from ACSR to ACSS, where that is a longer period of time. You can do the advanced reconductoring with carbon fiber-based cores, usually quite a bit faster. There's no tower modifications needed.
Mr. Breen, before you turn your camera off, so you're saying that leasing for an advanced conductor is being considered in some projects?
Some utilities are having, as you can imagine, some of the ones that have been hit by some wildfire risk recently are looking at alternative ways to finance some of their expansion, particularly ones that have not done capacity expansions or kept up with their capacity expansions. And I can't disclose names or anything, and I'll find out whether I can disclose the name of one of the entities looking at financing this is a fairly well-known entity that's in the space. But you may see, I'm just saying, you may see more of it. It may not come to fruition, but as some of the people on the call know, I do a presentation on advanced reconductoring as a first step in grid expansion, and this year. And my last comment is what's been the most significant. Usually my last slide is what has been the biggest what has had the biggest impact on transmission in the last year. And I go through a whole list of things that most people consider. And my argument at the end is the biggest thing that affected transmission this year was Warren Buffett's letter to his shareholders. So that tells you that's a lot about the capital availability and the capital costs going forward.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that comment. Seeing no additional hands up, that is, I think that brings us to the end of our workshop today. Really appreciate everybody's participation. Your input is really going to be very helpful in designing revised rules and in helping the commissioners come to a good place for the rulemaking, again, coming up end of this year or early next. Do you want to put it in a plug for the workshop that we have coming up on Monday from 1 to approximately 5 on the role of the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority and a few issues directly related to CETA regarding statewide transmission planning. Again, that's Monday, 1 o'clock Mountain Time. And with that, thank you, everyone. Again, comments, written comments would be more than welcome by Friday, December 13th. And I have a link here for the e-filings platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.